to introduce Mr. Dan Elwell. Mr. Dan Elwell, prior to forming Elwell and Associates, was the Deputy Administrator for the Federal Aviation Administration from November 2017 to November 2022. He also was an advisor of the Department of Transportation Security. He also served as the acting FAA administrator. Mr. Elwell served as the Assistant Administrator for Policy, Planning, and Environment. He served as Legislative Fellow for the late Senator Ted Stevens. Mr. Elwell was a Senior Vice President for Safety, Security, and Operations at Airlines for America. Mr. Elwell was Vice President of the Aerospace Industries Association. He represented civil aerospace manufacturers and led development and advocacy for the civil aerospace manufacturing industry for more than 300 companies making engines, airframes, space vehicles, satellites, and unmanned aircraft systems. Mr. Elwell was a commercial pilot for 16 years, it's amazing, with American Airlines, flying DC-10s, MD-80s, Boeing 757, 767 aircraft. Mr. Dan earned his pilot wings at Williams Air Force Base in Arizona after graduating from the University Air Force Academy, U.S. Air Force Academy, with a Bachelor of Science degree in International Affairs. Lieutenant Colonel Elwell retired from military service as a command pilot, get this, with more than 6,000 hours combined with civilian and military flight time in the U.S. Air Force and U.S. Air Force Reserve, including combat service during Operation Desert Storm. He currently serves on several private and public boards, including Alaska Airlines Group. So please join me as I welcome Mr. Dan Elwell.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. It makes me feel like I'm 80 years old.
Yeah, I hope I didn't forget anything important. I was trying to man, this is some awesome stuff.
Some of that, just for clarity, I did concurrently. So
awesome. Well, on the behalf of our university and our student body, I would just like to take the opportunity to just thank you for your time and also just to thank you for your service. So if you could, to start the tonight's event, you could just talk about your passion for aviation, how it began.
Well, let's see. I wasn't one of those kids that just dreamed of flying, although, and I don't know how many people here have had this, but I used to have dreams that I could fly. You ever had that? Yeah. So it wasn't one of those things that when I grow up, I'm going to be a pilot. But, and this dates me a little bit because this could never happen today in an elementary school. My 5th and 6th grade teacher, he was the same teacher for both grades. When I was growing up in Long Island, New York, he was a pilot, and he offered any of us in class over the weekend to fly with him. And he committed that he would fly any of us, and until as many of us wanted to fly, he would take us up. And so I took him up on it, and he put me in the right seat of I think it was a Cessna Skymaster, if I'm not mistaken, in out of Setauket, New York. And that was it, as they say, because I'd flown before as a kid, but I'd never been in the front of an airplane looking out. Took off and flew over my house, and I'd never seen my house from anywhere but the ground. So anyway, that was sort of the difference right there. But I still didn't know how I was going to do it. I didn't take lessons in that when I was in high school or anything. But Air Force Academy loomed out there, and I thought that was something to strive for. Anyway.
Sure. So, I would just echo that. Just it's a different experience, right? Being in the cockpit versus sitting in the back of the plane. I would definitely agree. So I would just like to expound on just your upbringing. What has helped you get to where you are now? What advice do you have for others that are pursuing a career in the aviation industry?
I'm going to steal advice from my colleague who's in the audience, Holly Woodruff Lyons, and she's 100% correct. Find a mentor. Mentorship is probably the single most important thing you can do. And for me, while I had a number of mentors growing up, and like we all do, I think what made the difference for me is sort of an attitude early on of carpe diem. I don't know if y'all are familiar with that term, but I've always sort of followed the philosophy that if you can't find a real valid reason not to do something that you want to do, as long as it's worthwhile, good, and legal, then you should do it. And you certainly shouldn't let what others say dissuade you. You certainly shouldn't let the inner voice that tends to be a little more conservative. You should do it. Carpe diem, seize the day. I made a number of decisions in the course of my career that many of my colleagues, and at the time, when I was in the airlines, when I was in the Air Force, and a couple other times, who've seriously questioned my sanity on a couple of things and course changes I made. But they all bore out, not because I knew they would,
yes, sir.
just because I wanted to do it, and I sort of followed my heart, I guess.
So, piggybacking off of our earlier question, in an interview with Rotor, we talked about you talked about your teacher, Mr. Tyler. Can you remember any other mentors, and how did you share that experience with the generation before you? Like, how did you share that with that experience?
So excuse me, I had a mentor in high school. He's passed, but Bob Burton was student body advisor when I was in student government stuff in high school. And he had a saying, we've probably all heard it, but you never get a second chance to make a good first impression.
Sure.
It's a pretty good way to go through life, especially when you're young and you're meeting people for the first time. You're going to that first interview, you're walking in that class for the first time. But more than that, he was a kind, thoughtful, selfless, and giving soul. And that was a great lesson as a young, selfish guy to have. And then along the way, professionally, I was very fortunate, always fortunate to have people whose opinion I trusted and put great faith in and use them mercilessly to get counsel in some of the things I've done. So, having those mentors, having, excuse me, for yourself, sort of your North Star, whether it is, a career goal or sort of an unbending principle that you have as a person. Just be true to yourself, and don't limit yourself. If everybody sitting in here is a student at Embry-Riddle, you're already, doing what I'm talking about. Yes. You're certainly chasing something that is that you want, or that you're passionate about.
So, as you look out into the audience at just the ambitious students and with different majors, different backgrounds, what advice would you give a student, maybe a freshman student, right, that's first coming to a school, institution like Embry-Riddle and has no idea about the aviation industry? What would you say to that person?
Is there anybody in here who doesn't know anything about the aviation industry?
I see a couple hands in the back.
Is there some unconverted in here? Oh, we're going to convert you. They say that it's one of those sort of basic primal urges that man has had from the beginning of time is to fly.
Yes, sir.
If you ask anybody, what are the 3, 4, 5 things that that you should do before you die, and I think flying's one of them. And I tell my family that, I tell friends that. I said, just go up at least one time, have a lesson. But if you're here and you're here for aviation, you're good. If you're here and you're not sure, don't leave this institution of all, without seeing what flying is about. It's more than a discipline. It's more than a lifestyle. It's so it really gets in your blood, becomes a way of life. Just talking to Dr. Barry earlier this evening about the desire, the lifelong, for some people, lifelong desire to learn how to fly, and just never giving up on that.
So when you were a student at the Air Force Academy, what books held your interest, or what things gave you motivation, when you faced hard times or some adversity? What books or?
After the Bible?
Yeah, after the Bible, definitely.
Okay. I would, there's only a couple books I've read twice in my life, and this one's going to sound like a strange one, but it's Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance.
Okay.
Show of hands. Anybody heard of that one? We have a few. I actually read that twice. And I think what captured me, I don't know anything about Zen or Buddhism or anything, but the discussion of quality and what defines quality. And I've done a lot of different things in my life, most of them aviation related, but I can't think of a discipline that requires the pursuit of quality, and you can expound on that in attention to detail and concentration more than more than aviation. And the second book that I should have read decades ago, but I just finished, but I recommend for anybody in any discipline in aviation to read Fate is the Hunter, if you haven't. I've read a lot of different books about flying, and I haven't read one as good as Fate is the Hunter. So recommend those two and the Bible.
Sure. Awesome. Awesome advice. What were some challenges and some adversity that you faced, if any, during maybe your time as a student at the Air Force Academy, acting deputy for the FAA? What were some of your biggest challenges, and how did you overcome those challenges?
Well, I think clearly the biggest challenge was this most recent term at the FAA.
Sure.
We had, I was at the FAA twice. First time I was at the FAA, I was a assistant administrator for policy. And my memory of that from 06 to 08 was it was a pretty benign 2 years. I mean, I learned a lot, great people, went home at night. It was the FAA I entered in 2017 did not resemble, sort of like coming here after 8 years. I didn't recognize this campus. I didn't recognize the FAA. And in part because of the job as deputy and then acting, but also because it was a tumultuous time. I mean, I started the role of acting administrator in the beginning of January 18. We immediately had a record-setting winter event in the Northeast, and we went very closely thereafter. We went into a government shutdown. Actually, the government shutdown was in 19. It was in 19. So what will be the sort of seminal events of my tenure as acting administrator was the MAX.
Okay.
And those, it was October 29th of 18 was Lion Air, and then March 10th of 19, so it was 18 and then 19, was Ethiopian.
So during that time, how did you hold your composure and, make the right decisions and not overreact per se? How did you go about decision making during that time?
So Lion Air, Lion Air was the first. We knew fairly quickly the cause of the accident. We also knew fairly quickly that it was a condition that, with the right reaction, it would be fairly simple to alleviate and fix. In fact, that very plane, Lion Air plane, the flight before had the same thing happen, and they did the right procedure. The problem was, due to poor write-up, poor maintenance procedures and others, it didn't get fixed. So, you know, we as we do in safety, is we methodically go through the problem, we identify the problem, we mitigate the problem, and work for the long-term fix. Mitigate the immediate, work for the long-term. And this part of the discussion, you'd be better to have Robert Zumwalt in the seat than me. But we figured out it was the MCAS. We figured out what they didn't do. We put out an emergency directive globally to all MAX operators. Be aware. While we believed that it would most likely never happen again, but if it did, this is what, just put this out, this is what your pilots must do. But, you know, 5 months later, the same thing happened, and for a completely different cause, almost as unlikely as the first, more unlikely than the first, but nevertheless, it happened. And while the crew at one point attempted to do, even discussed, you know, the bulletin, but they didn't do it.
Yes, sir.
And those two events were unspeakably tragic. I can remember having family members in the office less than a month after Ethiopian, and you never want to ever do that. So that led to a sequence of events that were difficult. The grounding of the MAX, you know, there was a lot made of the fact that the U.S. was, quote, the last, the U.S. and Canada. But there was solid data-driven safety reason for that.
Yes, sir.
And something that we thought would take a couple months ended up taking 20 months, which is to get the airplane back into service. So the short story is it consumed my tenure, really, at the FAA. And you know, hindsight is 2020, and especially in safety incidents, it can be brutal. But I really don't think I could have or would have done it any differently. I had all the right people in the room after each event, especially after the first event. There was some mitigating circumstances that prevented a swifter response to the software of the MCAS. The shutdown, the government shutdown, a couple other things, but yeah, that was quite a rough one for the whole industry, really.
Yeah. How did you not let that consume you, like off the clock, off work? How did you not let that consume you? You know, still go back to your family and still enjoy your life after a decision like that?
Well, I couldn't.
Yeah, I know.
Because it was in the news. It was you know, was everywhere, and it's one of the few times in my career, because unlike a lot of career aviation folks, I have 3 kids, and none of them went into aviation, and my wife hates to fly, so it's like, you know, it's like the odd one out in my family. But they were all, you know, on the edge of their seat with what happened with what happened to the MAX. And amazingly, those un-aviation family members suddenly became quite expert. So I had quite a household of critics. So I don't mean to make light of it, but just to show you that everybody had an opinion, whether it was an informed opinion or not. And that's lasted through the whole system and beyond, through the whole crisis and beyond. Some may have watched the Netflix quote documentary, which was really horribly done, unfortunately. And Netflix has quite an audience, so that happens in any high profile event. You're going to get mischaracterizations. The biggest challenge of a regulator and a lifelong safety person is to never lose focus on the goal, which is to do whatever you can do within your power to not let what happened happen again.
Yes, I agree.
And that's what I tried to do. It was made more difficult because, believe it or not, that accident and the aftermath of it was politicized in several different ways. So wading through the politicization of a safety event is tough. And I know Robert has experienced that in his tenure at NTSB. But makes your focus all the more important, which is the right decision, the safe decision, as best you can.
That's awesome. So I would say with that, how do you go about navigating? How do you tell someone who is like not confident in aviation as a mode of transportation, that looks at the news or looks and sees like a plane crash? Or how do you navigate that? And because everyone has a different risk tolerance, right? Everything's not going to be 100% safe. How do you go and show someone that it is actually safe to fly, or trust the industry per se?
I would say, or I would remind the audience and their family and friends, we've not had a fatal commercial aircraft accident in the United States since 2009. So in February 23, that'll be 14 years, God willing. There's a reason for that. 13 years, billions, with a B, of passengers traveled without a fatal crash. Now, we did lose that lady on the Southwest flight. But that was because of how safe our pilots are and our aircraft are. What could have been a catastrophic situation, as no life lost is acceptable, but there could have been a lot more than one life lost. We also need to look in the eye, I think, to the fact that there is a different set of standards globally for pilot training and for safety, and it's guided by the International Civil Aviation Organization. It is a set of standards that is it is meant to be the minimum. The FAA and the U.S. Safety standard in every category laid out by the international community is much higher, but there are some regions and some countries that use the ICAO bar because it's there. It's an international standard, and some of them are emerging and trying to get their own economies up and running their own transportation systems. I don't fault them that. What I think we need to do as an international community is have the courage among nation states that have commercial service and figure out a way to raise the bar.
Yes, sir. So after graduating U.S. Air Force Academy and serving our country, what led you to pursue a career, in the FAA administration and safety? Why not just stay a pilot? Why not become a pilot and do that for the rest of your career? What led you to that?
Yeah. Does anybody else have questions? These are tough. Yeah. These are actually tough questions.
Okay.
And I'll tell you why.
Okay.
Because the path was a strange one.
Okay.
I went out of the Air Force. Well, that wasn't a strange one. It was, I did my service. I owed 7 years total after I graduated. The airlines were hiring. I had a lot of colleagues and friends that were going and flying for different airlines. Then that lifestyle, as I was starting a family, presented itself as a bit more stable. And I just made the decision, and it wasn't easy, but I went to fly for American Airlines. And I was flying for American Airlines, stayed in the reserves because I wanted to get my military reserve retirement, which I eventually did. But I was flying Air Force and American, and an opportunity presented itself in the late 90s, I think it was 99, to take a year off from flying and take a congressional fellowship. And I was a political science major, and I thought, well, that'd be fun. I live right outside of DC. I can work Congress for a year if I can afford it, right? Because it would be leaving the airline pay for government pay for a year. So again, carpe diem. And I said, okay, this is the right thing to do, and this is what I'm going to do. And I spent a year on the Hill, which led me to come back to American Airlines, come back to flying, but flying for currency and working in the government affairs office in DC. The company thought it'd be helpful because of the experience I got in the Senate. And so I did that, went back to the line, and a couple months after going back to the line flying for American, 9/11.
Yeah.
9/11 happened. And that was sort of the inflection point for me. I had been bitten by the government policy legislative bug. I really enjoyed that. I kind of wanted to continue to be able to do both. But 9/11, some of you may, well, most of you in here probably weren't born, but some of you may know that one flight, the flight that hit the Pentagon, Flight 77, it came from DC. And I was flying that airplane at DC at the time and knew the entire crew on that airplane. Had flown with the captain of Flight 77 in the Pentagon countless times. A friend of mine been to my house, and it's just it was the flight that I would bid month in and month out. But I didn't that month because I was scheduled to be promoted to lieutenant colonel in the Pentagon on 9/11. And was actually getting ready to go to the Pentagon when everything started in New York. And when I called the Pentagon to see what, should we come in, shouldn't we? While I was on the phone, the plane hit. I heard it through the phone, and thankfully our Air Force office in the Pentagon was on the other side. That's shattering. That's not as shattering, of course, to those who lost family members, but it changed my entire perspective. It changed my perspective about what's important, what's not. Flying was not as important, flying commercially. And so after a couple of years of fretting and fiddling around and stuff, the question was answered. And the White House called and asked if I would be interested in taking a political appointment at the FAA. And I was 16 years at American at the time, and I didn't have, wasn't vested in retirement or anything. But again, it was one of those inflection points. It's carpe diem,
Seasonal.
And for me, leading in prayer, you sometimes don't need to be told twice.
I agree.
So I just, said, this is what I need to do, and this is what I'm going to do. And that was my first stint in the FAA, my first political appointment. In the Bush administration, lasted a couple of years. Then left, went into industry. You mentioned it, Airlines for America, Aerospace Industries Association, which in retrospect was a really nice complement to what I'd already learned operationally, learning about the issues that manufacturers have to face, the politics of airlines, and then after the Obama administration, the Trump administration came in and they needed help in the policy arena and asked if I would come help. I did, and that led to going back into the FAA as deputy and then acting administrator. So when you tell the story after the fact, it kind of makes sense. But when you're in it, like if somebody here said, "How would I become the FAA administrator?" There's no path you can direct.
True.
There really isn't. And at the end of the day, if you just do what you love, do it the best you can, be good to people, especially in Washington, D.C., because it can be a nasty place. And if you fall into that practice, you can't, you're not going to last. You just be good to people, do what you love, work hard.
Thank you.
That's all.
During this presentation, if anyone has any questions, feel free to make your way to the front, to one of the microphones to your right or to your left, one at a time, please, and ask away. So, follow-up question to that would be what are your predictions of the future of our industry? 5 to 10 years down the road, what do you think?
Yeah. Well, I'm really excited. I do currently do a lot of advising and work in the AAM, Advanced Air Mobility sector. I'm on the board of advisors to Joby Aviation, which is a exciting eVTOL company with some really bold ideas about changing the face of air transportation. So I think advanced air mobility, air taxis, drones, both small 107 drones and big drones and cargo delivery. I think the advances in commercial space are going to just be exciting. I think autonomy, AI in aviation, training. Everything I saw today on campus in the training blew away by so many multiples what I went through in the Air Force, which I thought at the time was state of the art, was the greatest thing. And by the way, just a little editorial comment, as the quality of training now is so good, mm-hmm. and yet we a couple of years ago said, well, now it's almost 10 years ago, but sort of ignored the quality of the training and said, oh, you need 1,500 hours before you can get into the right seat. I won't go there, but we need to start thinking, quality is magnified so much. Maybe quantity maybe doesn't need to as much, but so I think we're going to see incredible developments in training. We're continue to see incredible developments in training. We're going to see autonomy is going to make some serious leaps, but I think it's all going to happen technologically in the lab and at these great, smart, out-of-the-box thinking companies before all of that happens in the mind of the traveling public. Mm-hmm. So we'll be ready to do it before the public will be ready to enjoy it, I think.
In a previous interview, you mentioned, I think it was the crawl, walk, run mm-hmm. method. Like
you did your research.
I did my research, yes, sir. Yes, sir. So one of the summer's film blockbusters was Top Gun Maverick. I'm a business student, and coming from a background with no interest in aviation at all, coming here was just sucked in to the culture, and now I'm very passionate. I myself wanted to fly after watching that movie, and during that movie, there was a conflict between autonomy versus the human element. So could you talk a little bit about the pros and cons of...
First of all, that scene is a clear ripoff on Star Wars.
Yes, sir.
Was it not? Was it not a ripoff of Star Wars?
Yes, sir.
Remember when Luke is going into the Death Star and the automatic thing that dropped the bomb in the hole didn't work, and the other guy said use the Force?
Yes, sir.
This is almost exactly what happened when that, I forget the actor that played the son of Goose. He's like hears his dad's voice. Anyway, I think it was a little bit maybe of a comment that, when it comes right down to it, it's the human factor, the human element that is really what's most important. And of course, that's true, right? Because humans are developing the autonomy and the AI that we're eventually, I think, going to make our industry even safer. It was a good movie.
It was a great movie.
Way better than the first one.
Oh, yeah.
I thought. Anyway. What was your question again?
Just the pros and cons of automation versus like human element. Do you think eventually there will be a need for human pilots, or do you think that basically robots will take over the industry?
It's a little bit similar to the surface issue with cars, right?
Okay. Yes, sir.
So autonomous cars are never going to be, if every car on the road was autonomous, all following exact identical logarithms. I'm not an engineer, but the software and the logarithms are all the same. But for an act of God, they're not going to get in an accident. You're never going to get all autonomous cars. So as long as humans are involved, there will be error, there will be mistakes, there'll be pedestrians or whatever. And I think there is in this country, I don't know what the rest of the world, but in this country, there's such a huge general aviation population. Yes. And general aviation flyers don't fly, they fly because they love to fly. You're always going to have people in the airspace stick and rudder. And so that is the one thing that is going to complicate going to pure autonomy in any other sector for the time being. But I, never underestimate the power of man's intellect to figure out that problem. We don't call it see and avoid in the autonomous world. We call it detect and avoid. And how good will the detect and avoid be going forward? I don't know.
You have a question, sir? Okay.
Do you think we will ever reach a point where we have a single pilot Part 121 operations?
I do, and I think it's necessary before we go to autonomous. Although it's conceivable that we could go to autonomous cargo ops before single pilot. I actually, I think that the public would accept that quicker than a single pilot. On the other, and also because I think autonomous cargo ops will be sort of the canary in the coal mine for the public to say, look, we've been doing it with cargo safely for however length of time. When we go to single pilot ops, we should present it for what it will be. It will be autonomous with a monitoring pilot is what it'll be. And so once everybody's comfortable with that, is my prediction is we'll let go of we will get to pilotless ops with passengers.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Great question.
Do you think that supersonic travel is going to be
I don't know if it'll be the main thing, but I think it's going to come back. There's really only one company at it right now, and they currently don't have a power plant, so that's a bit of a problem. But I think the biggest obstacle to supersonic flight are the current noise standards we have for takeoff and landing. They can get past that, and they can fix the boom over land restriction, which, by the way, was an arbitrary reg. It wasn't based on anything. It was just, I wasn't around when they did it, but they said supersonic flight over the continental US is no longer okay. And I hate when we make regulations out of thin air. without data.
Yeah, I know there's a couple of companies that have been like building flying jets, and major airlines have invested in those companies. So.
Yeah, so United's pre-ordered some boom aircraft again. They don't have an engine, so that's a problem. And I like Blake, and I like the company. I like everybody working there. They have a big hurdle to get over, and regulatorily they have a big hurdle to get over. And unlike technological developments like AI and things that computers you can put in the airplane to make things work safer, supersonic still, and hypersonic eventually, has basic aerodynamics that they got to figure out. And we're not getting we're not a world that is getting more tolerant of noise. We're getting less all the time, which is why I kind of like AAM, because most of the eVTOL players are pretty quiet. So that's one of the things I think is going to be helpful.
Thanks.
Thank you.
I want to thank you for coming here. You look familiar. Did you and I sit next to each other on a couple of occasions? Yeah, I think we did in some congressional hearings. I want to thank you for your candor as it relates to the MAX situation and how that was personally. We had different roles. All the weight was on you. I could always deflect the questions to the FAA. So thanks for your candor on that. You had the opportunity today to walk around campus. You went to the Microplex. You had lunch with some students. You've looked around the campus, seen the flight line. You've seen a lot of what we do here. What are your impressions of Embry-Riddle?
They were always very high, and this is a school I always have had a great amount of respect for, and it just went through the roof today. And you know, you've lived your whole life in aviation. You go to an aviation school and it's like Disneyland, and everything you see is you know, excitement, aviation excitement. The quality now of the facilities, and not that it was not quality, you know, 8 years ago. It just keeps getting better and better. And this is, you know, I went to the Air Force Academy where, you know, wow, it doesn't get better than that, you know. But we just soloed in a 172 while we were there, and we flew some sailplanes. I mean, this is top notch, and I'm hoping everybody in here who's in a aviation discipline appreciates what you have here.
Well, we certainly are happy that you came, and we appreciate the time that you gave up to come and visit. And thanks for a great presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Did you have a question? Yeah.
Welcome. You mentioned about philosophy. I enjoy philosophy today. I read a sentence by British philosopher Bertrand Russell. A life without adventure is likely to be unsatisfying, but a life in which adventure is allowed to take any form is sure to be short. The gist of the message is we need to prepare for the uncertainty. During your term at FAA, you mentioned about we had a government shutdown, and in my dissertation, I found out during that shutdown time, most of aviation safety inspectors were furloughed, and that's a dangerous situation. It seems like such bad things happened before many times during previous federal government shutdown. I just wondering, from your perspective, how does FAA will deal with like those waves from the political storm in the future? And that time, did you make any statement to prevent such terrible things happen to your frontline employees?
Yeah. Wow, that's a great question. The FAA became a political football with that most recent shutdown, and and it was a game of chicken. Holly, you would remember more details about the lead up to it, but basically, one party or one chamber called the bluff of the other, and bam, we have a shutdown. It was the longest one in history. It was 35 days. And yes, we furloughed. We had to because we didn't have money to literally stop funding of the FAA. But I'll tell you, there was enough experience, and this is this doesn't make it okay. And we certainly did not officially communicate this, but people who go through hard times communicate. In every shutdown where people were sent home without paychecks, when the shutdown ended, they were repatriated everything that they weren't paid. And in honesty, everyone knew that. Didn't make it easier to not go to work. I think it did make it a little less scary. But in a way, it's sort of government protecting itself against itself. It's like, these are procedural games that politicians play, but we have to be sure that we do right by the civil servant. And as crazy as the dynamics are, they do. When they finally sort of pull themselves out of the craziness, they will make things right. It was particularly difficult for us because it was so long, B, because we had some serious stuff that was going on right in the middle of that shutdown. And as I recall, I met with the president several times in my tenure, but that during the shutdown was one of them. And he literally pulled me in with the secretary to ask what was the stress on the system. And I'm not quite sure, where he would have gone with that if I had said, it's at the breaking point. And unfortunately, as the acting administrator, when Congress says, you're done, we're not funding you, there's nothing to do. And in politics of the executive branch, you follow leadership with regard to whether or not you're going to go up on the soapbox and make any kind of, noise. And so I know it sounds a little bit callous. The controllers were unbelievable in coming to work without pay the entire 35 days. But they did. And it was bad. I really don't know. And then now they're talking about bringing sequestration back, I've heard. You make a good point. I don't know the answer.
Thank you for your honesty.
Thanks for the question.
So I have one more question too. So as a leader in our industry, I'm inspired by your passion for the future of our industry and just the innovation, as well as staying dedicated to safety, of course. So we talked earlier about the difference between passenger versus cargo. So what are some cargo companies that you feel are making that advancement in the autonomous realm? Do you have have you been working with any companies in the field?
So Amazon is a client. We've all watched Amazon technological prowess proliferate, but they're flying old 767s. They're wet leasing a dozen or so from Atlas, and so you've seen them. It's a prime livery, but they're doing it the old-fashioned way, right? Here's a little interesting stat I heard about Amazon. They have now 16 767s, and they're wet leasing Sun Country, Cargo Lift, and a couple of others. And all of that is 3%. 3% of the merchandise they're moving around this country every day. So it's mind-boggling. And to me, there's some really cool ideas going on package delivery with large drones. And when I say large, I mean, the 107 limit's 55 pounds, so above 55, but smaller than a full-size aircraft that can carry, medium, size packages. And there's some companies looking at how to do that last mile, middle mile, all autonomous depots, autonomous arrival, drop off, pickup, all done by bots and robots in containers. And whether that's going to really take hold, I don't know. But you look at what COVID did to the cargo world, and a lot of that's subsided. But there's a threshold of lift that COVID, that the public got used to with UPS and Amazon and others, that's never going to go away. My house went from a box a day on the porch to now 2 a day.
Yeah.
And it's it's not changing.
So do you think that drones would take over that space, the cargo and shipment, even in the government as well?
I think you'll see less vehicles on the road eventually.
Yeah.
I think you're going to see more direct drone delivery cargo, 10 years from now.
Well, even in the military, you look at the Reaper drone. What do you think? Do you think that that's a future for sure? Or do you think there are going to be regulations that just prolong the process, or we might not eventually get to fully autonomous, even in the cargo industry?
Like I said, I think we're going to see fully autonomous cargo aircraft.
Okay.
I mean, Fred Smith's been saying that for 20 years.
Yeah.
And I agree with him. I think we'll see it in cargo first. Now, the drone last mile, middle mile stuff, that remains to be seen. I think it's going to happen. It's just I can't make a prediction on when.
Yes, sir. I think you got a question, sir.
Good evening. Okay, I'm trying to see how close I need to get to get this to work. Good evening, sir. I want to segue back quite a bit in this conversation as it's back to automation and pilots. Particularly in your experience in the FAA and the policy area, how do you think the FAA will pursue in the future the interaction between pilots and autonomous systems, particularly not multiple aircraft, not just in singular aircraft?
So are you talking about pilots of remotely piloted vehicles or cockpit pilots?
It's from fully piloted vehicles, ATC, and autonomous vehicles, as radio traffic is frequently a very good method of situational awareness, at least in my experience.
So you're asking about how are we going to rationalize manned versus unmanned in the same ATC system?
Yes.
Well, that's being worked on right now. The remote ID rule that the FAA passed and then recently set up the means of compliance for that. Remote ID is as much for security as it is for safety, but eventually it'll help with detect and avoid. The right-of-way rules, once drones get into the controlled airspace, are going to have to be really laid out. I think ADS-B in and out is going to help. I don't want to see a bifurcated air traffic system. I don't want to see, okay, if you don't have this, this, and this, you can fly here, and if you do, you can, and all of that's going to take time. I have heard of, there is a company called Merlin Labs that's looking at AI and machine learning between ATC and potentially in drones, as well as improving signals between ATC and piloted aircraft. And then figuring out how the three come together and know where everybody is at the same time and then act appropriately. That's the That's the one that's the whole thing that we haven't quite figured out yet. And we can't integrate the airspace until we do. Great question.
Thank you.
You're
That's
welcome.
an awesome question. So with that question as well, are there any security issues that arise to automation that you can just foresee, such as like a plane being compromised that was fully autonomous, right? Being compromised by an international or even a domestic.
Mm-hmm. So cyber concerns are,
Cyber concerns.
of course, huge. And I think the FAA needs to be a little bit more proactive it currently doesn't have cybersecurity standards for certification of an aircraft. They're just working on their first few certification efforts on drones, right? Large drones. So I think first we need to get smarter in the FAA with what those certification requirements for resiliency, cyber resiliency would actually look like. And the only way we can get that is from industry. So the assumption all along has been the FAA has in certifying a Boeing or validating an Airbus aircraft is you've built in the resiliency to being spoofed or being, hacked. But we haven't, there isn't a process by which the manufacturer proves that, right? So I don't want it to get to a point where it happens and then, we got to figure out how to stop that. We got to be proactive, and we got to figure out, what kind of standards within a certification, Part 25, 23, whatever, needs to be in place.
Yes, sir.
And because increasingly there's wireless communications across an airframe, wireless communications from the cockpit to flight controls.
True.
So, and I'm not an IT guy, but I'm told that if it's anything that is wireless can be messed
Compromised,
with.
yeah. That's awesome. Questions, sir?
Oh, he was first.
He was first? Okay, I was going to say.
Thank you for the great speech, first of all. And I want to go once again to the one pilot cockpit, which we already discussed today a couple of times. So, because you mentioned earlier in your speech that finding a mentor is this one single advice you would give to anyone, how it can be replaced if there is only one pilot? Because we know, usually we have a captain, first officer, so they share experience, right? So how it's going to be replaced if you have just one pilot, and maybe how it's going to affect the pilot training in the foreseen future?
That's a great question. Anybody ever see the movie 2001: Space Odyssey? Okay, so Hal would be the model for the co-pilot, and I'm being facetious. For those who don't know the movie, Hal takes over and all hell breaks loose. But I think what I envision with a single pilot operation in a large aircraft is a monitor, right? It is a systems monitor because the plane is virtually autonomous already. But to your point, there could be anomalies that require what would have required some cockpit resource management, some conference. And I think that what we would be wise, to your point, to have available for that single pilot, either a virtual co-pilot with AI, who can throw things back and forth. That would make sense. Of course, you also have dispatch, or you have whatever. But I think it is a necessary development to get to one, to prove that case, to prove that one can do it. And of course, it would be a period of time that would be data gathering and comfort level building, for the industry and the public? I know I sort of evaded that question, I think.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you for your time tonight. This was a little earlier in the conversation, but I would like to ask about the transition from leading a flight deck to leading the FAA, and what skills kind of transition, and what are some of the hard lessons you may have had to learn while leading the administration.
That's a great question. But there's one common thread in those two examples, and they're great examples, is don't forget to make a decision. So whether you're on a flight deck with 7 crew members, load masters, engineers, navigators, co-pilots, or you're in the executive suite at FAA, get the feedback, get the information, distill it, and make a decision. You'd be amazed how many people in positions of authority cannot make a decision.
I know we leaped from pilots to automation, but in the middle of that, I would like to ask a question regarding eVTOL, because I interned at an eVTOL company this summer. Do you believe that? So before we go to automation, we'll probably have to go to like some sort of hybrid. The aircraft itself, right? It'll have to be either hybrid or fully electric, possibly. Do you think that has a better impact? I know you served as the vice president for safety, security, and operations, but also the environment. Do you think that has an impact on the environment? You think that would be sustainable for our industry? Electric and hybridization, hybrid.
Yeah, I mean, it's look. It remains the most energy. I don't know, the scientists in the room help me, but the most energy efficient mode of propulsion in aviation is fossil fuel.
Okay.
Per pound, per ounce, per gallon, however you want to do it. So when you hear people talk about hydrogen, to carry, start with a 767 or 777, and what you have to do to be able to move that many people the same distance that we currently do with kerosene or with Jet A or with fossil fuel is not viable.
Yeah.
It's not currently possible. Having said that, the company I advise, I'm working with Joby Aviation, has a vehicle that can carry 5 people, 150 miles at 200 knots, purely electric. That's pretty cool. So, and I think that going forward, as that technology gets better and better and better, and the slightly longer and longer legs, and maybe better payloads, or maybe the carriage of hydrogen will make itself a more viable alternative. Excuse me. Or hybrid. But we have to face the fact that sustainable aviation fuels is the way to go forward. And we have a lot of problems to solve before SAF becomes the dominant way to fuel aircraft. And SAF isn't, obviously it's not fossil fuels, but it is the bridge to whatever form of energy we're going to use 30 years from now.
Okay. Any other question?
Yes.
What is your prediction as to the regulatory future for large 55 plus pound UASs and Part 137 ag operations?
I'm not familiar with Part 137 ag operations.
Crop dusting and that sort of thing.
So remember, drones of any size have always been, the big selling point for them for years has been use them for your dull, dirty, and dangerous jobs, right? And of course, we're already well on the way on the dull, pipeline inspections, BNSF doing rail inspections mile after mile. and of course, the dirtiest first responder stuff. And I would put crop dusting in the dangerous. I'd put firefighting. There's a whole bunch of stuff that currently kill pilots on a fairly regular basis that could be absolutely replaced by drone flying. And I think that the regulatory future for that is first to get these vehicles certified. And we should be able to chew gum and walk at the same time and figure out the operational standards while we do that. I think the under 500 feet flying should be pretty straightforward and easy. Crop dusting, there's a lot of people who love to do crop dusting and they don't want to be out of jobs, but there's a ton of farms that would, love to have that done cheaper. So, the economic incentives are huge. Joby, for instance, their business model is basically a nonprofit with a pilot, and they're going to start with a pilot. So, you're going to have to. There's big, exciting things happening.
So I would say, in closing, if there was one thing that you hope the audience would take away from the discussion, what would it be?
From our session here?
Yes, from this discussion.
Well, I like to think that my story, if you will, is not inspiring, but it should be proof that you can basically start from anywhere and get to anywhere you can. And my path was, it is not linear. And Lon, you and I were talking about this, especially, I don't know if especially in aviation, but particularly in aviation, you can have a career that is not linear. And when I say linear, I mean, always get a pay raise, always get more responsibility, always do the, climb in where you are. Aviation's changing too rapidly. So take away from this that you can do anything in this space, anything. I'm proof of that. All the things that I've done, I don't have an engineering degree, I have a poli-sci degree, for Pete's sake. Maybe the most worthless degree there is. No offense, but I did it, so.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity just to glean from your wisdom. If we could give a hand for Mr. Elwell, that'd be amazing.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Elwell.